Good day everyone, I am Lila Oboiser and today we will gonna tackle chapter 17 entitled The Amount and Distribution of Practice. So in this lesson, we will define overlearning in terms of how it relates to the decision about the amount of practice time needed to learn motor skills. Describe how an overlearning practice strategy influences the learning of procedural skills and dynamic balance skills. Discuss the relationship between overlearning and other practice variables. And describe how the concept of practice distribution is related to the intertrial interval and to the length and distribution of practice sessions. So we also gonna discuss the evidence supporting the benefit for distributed practice of the distribution of process, sessions, and possible possible reasons for this benefit. So we also gonna compare and contrast massed and distributed intertrial interval schedules for discrete and continuous motor skills. And lastly, we will gonna describe how to implement knowledge of massed and distributed practice in various skill learning situations. We have here the famous quote from Benjamin Franklin that says, "Practice makes perfect." But the question is, how much time or how much amount of time we will devote ourselves into practicing to have a better performance? So teachers, coaches, therapists have a big role in this because they make important decisions about the amount of practice the people should engage in, as well as how much time to devote to the various activities within and across practice sessions with the total amount of practice time available. So in this lesson, we will consider these situations. So it seems likely that a dance teacher would encourage a dancer who was a bit tentative in certain parts of a routine to spend as much as time as possible going over the routine repeatedly in practice. So no, that's the role of the teacher kasi or the coach when dancing. To we have to repeat or we have to make the student repeat the routine to make it to have a better performance, no? So and next situation is a golf instructor would probably try to help a person be more successful when putting by encouraging the persons to spend as much time as possible on the practice putting green. So we know that in order to have to be good at what we're doing, we have to spend a lot of time in practicing. So that's the role of the coach. And lastly, and a therapist would typically encourage a rehabilitation patient to practice the skill he or she was relearning as often as possible. For example, he is a physical or dancer therapist, or physical therapist. So, maingon gid na siya, sasabihin talaga niya sa kanyang patient na kailangan i-relearn mo to, kailangan mag-spend ka ng time dito para mas madali mong ma-relearn ang iyong skills. The amount of practice a person must spend to a skill is very important when learning a motor skill. So in our succeeding lessons, we will focus on the amount of practice a person needs to ensure achieving a specific learning goal associated with a specific period of practice. There are many situations in which it is important to determine the amount of practice people should experience to have specific skill learning goals. And there are a lot of factors that limit those situations. Just for like in sports settings. So, the amount of practice time available is restricted by a season schedule or by rules established by professional association. So, those athletes cannot practice every day or every time because may finapalo kasi sila na schedule. Or another example is in rehabilitation context. So, the amount of time available for therapy is typically restricted by healthcare provider agencies. So, sabi ko nga, hindi lahat ng oras na pwede sila mag-practice. Kasi, meron kasi mga factors na mag-restrict talaga para ma-practice yun. So, kailangan talaga na mag-determine tayo ng amount of time that we will practice our skills in order to have a better output for the future.
So, good morning everyone, or good day everyone. Today we will tackle about the overlearning and learning motor skills. Researchers historically have investigated the relationship between the amount of practice and the achievement of specific performance goals within the topic of overlearning. So, unsa ba ang overlearning? Overlearning is the continuation of practice beyond the amount needed to achieve a certain performance criterion. So, ang overlearning daw is ay continuation practice. Bahala pa og nahuman na ang set nga amount of time na gihatag ana. So, ga-continue gihapon ka og practice ana. For example, throwing a ball. The teacher then requires students to achieve the performance criterion during class. So, ipa-record daw og number of trials it took for the students to teach that goal and then require a specified number for additional practice trials to implement an overlearning practice condition. So, during daw sa class is practice sila on saan pag-throw og ball. Then after nag-record sila og kung kapila nila gibuhat. And then after din nga achieve na nila nga goal is nag-require pa din ang maestra og specified number for additional practice. So, additional, it means moral gyapon siya ga-continue practice. So, mao na ang isa nga example sa overlearning. From a theoretical perspective, the assigning of extra practice has merit. So, according to motor program-based motor learning theory, extra practice helps strengthen the general motor program and response schema for the skill a person is learning so that the person can call it into action more readily when necessary. So, according daw sa motor program-based motor learning theory, ang extra practice daw is maka-increase og mapa-strengthen ang general motor program para if ever nga imo nang i-execute na nga skills is ready na ka and kabalo na pud ka sa imong buhaton. So, from a dynamical system theory perspective, extra practice is a means by which a learner increases the stability of the coordination and control characteristic in the performance of the skill. So, sa dynamical system theory daw is, ang extra practice daw kay means para ang mga students or ang learners is ma-increase nila ang ilahang stability of the coordination and ang control po sa characteristics sa performance. So, Driscoll, Willis, and Cooper, 1992, reviewed and analyzed 15 research studies that investigated several hypotheses related to overlearning. So the first notable point about this review is that the issue of overlearning has not generated a great deal of research over the years. And the 15 studies covered research articles published from 1929 to 1982. These studies involve almost 4,000 subjects. So the result of this review indicated that for motor skill learning, overlearning has a positive influence on retention performance. Driscoll et al. 1992 review provides a comprehensive overview of overlearning as it relates to skill acquisition. It does not evaluate effects related to specific types of motor skills. So, overlearning strategy for learning procedural skills. Procedural skills constitute one type of motor skill particularly well suited to deriving benefits from an overlearning practice strategy. A procedural skill is an interesting combination of cognitive and motor components. For example, people perform procedural skills when their jobs require them to put together the components of a circuit board for a computer or type form a written text. So, diba pag sa butanta mag-assemble ka og circuit board is naman ay procedure nga imong gina-follow. Step by step, imo nang i-follow. Dapat from first to last, imo gyud siya ma-execute. And then, ang written text pod is from title, conclusion, inana, dapat pod imo siyang i-follow. So, nagya po siya procedure nga imong gina-follow. Pero, a common problem with the procedural skills is that people tend to forget what to do to carry out the entire procedure. So, di ba, sometimes pag step-by-step na procedure or step-by-step na mga buluhaton, usahay kay, may isa nga step nga kakalimtan nato or wala na, marag, ang pag kuha na nato, 1, 2, 3 is marag, nakalimtan na natong sunod, sunod, inana. So, maupod na ang isa ka problema sa procedural skills. So, for example, several years ago, the U.S. Army was interested in improving the performance of soldiers for a procedural skill that involved assembling and disassembling machine guns. So, this skill was important to study because soldiers typically learned it into a short training period but did not perform it when so wala nila gina-perform nila again after sa training. So, ang pag-disassemble o assemble na is daily part sa ilahang daily duties or daily routines. So, the problem was that when they perform a later test in this skill, the soldiers typically showed a large decrement in performance or nag-decrease ang ilahang performance. So, before, nag-decrease daw ang ilang performance sa pag-assemble o disassemble. Kesa atong nag-training pa sila o katong i-evaluate sila after silang training. Okay, to overcome this problem, researchers for the U.S. Army Research Institute, Skendon Hagman, 1982, proposed that an overlearning training strategy, which they refer to as overtraining, would be effective for decreasing the amount of soldiers forgot about the procedure. So the researcher compared two forms of overtraining to a no overtraining situation. One form was the immediate overtraining condition, and the second is overtraining condition. Ang immediate overtraining condition, which required soldiers to perform 100% more trials, than they require to achieve a performance. Criterion of one correct assembly and disassembly trial. Tapos ang overtraining condition also involve an additional 100% more practice trials, but these trials were administered as refresher. Training midway through the 8-week retention interval used for all subjects. So, interval daw. Ang immediate overtraining is ilang i-perform 100 more trials than they require to achieve the performance. Tapos, ang sa overtraining condition pod nga is ang which they referred as refresher is midway through 8-week retention interval. Based on the result of this experiment, the authors recommended the immediate overtraining procedure because it was most cost and time effective. Ang reason behind is ang trainees daw were already in the training session. It would take less time and money to have them engage in additional practice rather than to bring them back several weeks later for a refresher training. So next is the overlearning strategy for learning dynamic balance skills. So in an experiment that involved learning a skill that has less of a cognitive component than the gun assembly disassembly skill, Melnick 1971 investigated the use of overlearning for a dynamic balance skill. This experiment continues to be the only one reported in the research literature that involves the overlearning of a dynamic balance skills. So, in addition to addressing the question of whether practice beyond the amount the learner needed to achieve a performance criterion was beneficial, Melnick asked whether there was an optimal amount of extra practice. So in this experiment, people practiced balancing in a stable meter until they were able to achieve a performance criterion of being unbalanced 28 out of 50 seconds. After achieving this criterion, each group was required to perform further trials in one of the following amounts: 0% non, 50% to 100% or to 200% of the initial number of trials of practice. Then all the participants perform a retention test twice, once a week and then 1 month after practice. So after nakana nila ang result, the result showed that all amounts of extra practice were beneficial, although beneficial siya, then before the result shows that all amounts of extra practice were beneficial, diba? So this means that all the groups that engage in extra practice like nagdungag sila extra practice lang beyond what they needed to achieve the performance can perform better. So mas ni better ang ilahang performance kay nagkuan man sila og extra practice. Pero although additional practice is beneficial, increasing the amount of additional practice beyond the 50% amount was not proportionally more beneficial to retention performance. Ang kuan ani is, di ba, kuan man siya nga, 0, tapos 50%, tapos 100%, tapos 200%. Ang result sa 50% na amount na nagkuan og additional practice is same ra gihapon siya sa retention test sa nagkuan nga 100% o 200% nga extra practice. So So, beneficial lagi ang extra practice, pero increasing the amount of additional practice beyond the 50% amount was not proportionally more beneficial to retention lagi daw. Tapos, ang supporting evidence for the lack of benefit for additional practice beyond a certain amount was reported by Quickle and Regenar 2002 for physical therapy sessions, which is kanang pag even though kag extra practice. So, the overlearning strategy in physical education. So, researchers have demonstrated the presence of the diminishing returns phenomenon for the learning skills in physical education classes. So, ang good example is an experiment by Goldberger and Gurney 1990, which is ang teacher rotated format in which the teacher divided the class into the 5 subgroups and assigned each to one of the 5 stations where they practiced a specified skills for 5 minutes. At the end of every 5 minutes, students rotated to a new station. So, if kabantay mo anang every station, lahi-lahi nga skills nga ilahang matun-an. So, pag mahuman na ang 5 minutes nga time, is ato na po sila lain nga station. Ug lahi na po nga learning ang ilahang or lahi na po nga skills ang ilahang tun-an dito for every 5 minutes until mahuman nila og libot ang station. So, mao na ang teacher rotated format. So, ang second is ang learning rotated format. They received index cards describing what they needed to do at each station and then were told to use their 25-minute efficiency to practice each skills. Everyone practiced like this for 2 class periods and 2 days. The next week, the students performed the skills in a test. So, ang skills nga ilang gina-practicean ani is ang football skills. Okay, ang result daw shows that 2 groups differed in terms of number of practice trials for these skills but not in the test performance. So, ang ilan daw practice trials kay different, lahi-lahi sila. Pero, ang sa test performance, same lang. Ang learner rotated format group students is nag-perform sila from 0 to 67 trials, tapos ang teacher rotated group pod nag-perform sila from 0 to 87 trials, which means ang practice trials sa teacher rotated group is daghan kesa sa learner rotated group. But there was no difference between the groups in the amount of improvement. So, bisan pag nag-differ sila sa practice trials, pero ang ilang test performance, morara nag-resin. So, the additional amount of practice induced by the teacher-rotated format did not yield an additional skills performance improvement benefit on the retention test. Thus, given the time constraint of the unit of instruction, the learner-rotated format was superior because it provide more efficient use of the available practice time. So, naapoy disadvantage ang teacher-rotated format kay given labi mo og limited time, 5 minutes. Tapos, what if within 5 minutes, dili na nimo makaya o panang skills? Tapos, muadto na po kaglain nga station. Para different tapos nga skills. Tapos, ang sa learner rotated format is kamo naman magbuot for kani nga skills. Inyuhan na nga time, kamo na magbuot unsa nga time nga inyuhan na practice. Hantod ma-master niyo yun, then lahi na pod. Hantod mo human din, ug hantod mahurot ang oras. So, ang sa teacher rotated is limited lang ang imong oras, pero daghan ang imuhang matun-an kay within every station naman kay matun-an pero limited ang time. Pero ang sa learner rotated format kay gamay ra imong practice trials pero makakuan mo gyapon ka kay wala may time limit nga 5 minutes lang kani nga skills kamo man magbuot. And pag imo po siyang i-compare sa test performance, same magyapon siya sa teacher rotated format o ang learner rotated format. So that would be the end of my discussion.
Okay, so our next topic is the learning and other practice variables. So overlearning is the continuation of practice beyond the amount needed to achieve a certain performance criterion. So when we say overlearning, it can be useful for a learner to continue to practice a skill even though he or she can perform it correctly. So such practice increases the performance of the person's capability to perform the skill at some future time. So, however, the research investigating the learning strategy has shown rather conclusively that the amount of practice is not the critical variable influencing motor skill acquisition. Why? It is because with this, it has shown that the practice does not make perfect, but it is rather perfect practice that can make perfect. So, the amount of practice variably interacts with some other practice-related variable to yield optimal skill. So the optimal skill, or it is a self-directed learning that one where students or a persons develop the skills to set them up for his or himself. So you have seen this interaction with a number of practice-related variables, such as the type of the frequency, augmented feedback, and the variability. So, the variability of the practice. So, to establish an optimal learning environment, the instructor or the learner also must take other practice conditions, characteristics into account. So, it is important to note that this perspective does not mean that one amount of practice is unimportant. So, it does mean that the amount of practice cannot be considered in isolation, but in terms of its interaction with other practice condition variables. So, to establish, or in order to establish an optimal learning environment, yes, the instructor and the learner must take the practice condition in characteristic into account. So, it is important to note that practice does not mean that the amount of practice is unimportant na siya, no? So, it does mean that the amount of practice cannot be considered, or dili siya pwede nga ma-separate, but in terms of its interaction with other practice condition in variables. So next, the distribution of practice. So practice distribution, or it is sometimes referred to as the spacing of practice, so has been a popular topic for research into motor learning for many years. So the most popular era for this study extended from the 1930s through the 1950s. So when practice distribution was seen as a way to test learning theories popular at that time. However, researchers have continued to investigate practice distribution issues because of its relevance to applied settings in a variety of contexts. So, even from this part, the distribution of practice the researchers still continue to investigate or research further since it is relevant in any context. One of the issue that was the focus of much of the early research concerned the amount of the rest people need between practice trials to ensure the optimal learning environment. So this issue was the question of whether massed or distributed practice trials provided for better learning of motor skills. So when we say when we want to learn something well, studying the information or practicing the task just once is almost and always inadequate, right? So as the research, the learning advantage of distributed over mass practice is known as the spacing effect. So the research evidence is clear effect the research evidence it's clear that the space or distributed practice is superior to mass practice for long-term learning and retention. So mao to ang nakalabang kang mao to siya ang advantage ni distributed practice no over kay mass practice. So that is why some researchers argued that distributed practice was better. Others maintained that it did not make much difference which spacing strategy an instructor followed. So, mo to siya nga, some researchers nag-argued nga si distributed practices was better rather kaysa kay over kay mass practice. There are some said nag-ingon nga did not make much difference which spacing strategy an instructor followed. And although this early controversy focused on between trial rest intervals, the study of practice distribution also concerned the amount of practice during each session of practice and that amount of rest between the sessions. So, the next or the second practice distribution issue that they are focusing is that the question of concern is whether it is better to have fewer but longer session or more but shorter sessions. So it is better to have fewer basa distributed practice but longer session or more but shorter sessions.
Mass and distributed practice are the two terms that was used by the researchers only to know the specific distribution schedules as an alternative in assigning specific amounts of time in which it would allow for more objective definition for these two terms. So, we'll talk about the definition about mass practice. This is a practice schedule in which the amount of rest between practice sessions or trials is very short. Then, distributed practice is also a practice schedule in which the amount of rest between practice sessions or trials is relatively long. So, both of these terms, mass and distributed practice, are defined in relation to each other. So that means to say that the main or the common for their definition are the relative lengths of the time for active practice and rest. That was the common definition for the both terms. Let us focus on mass practice. So, this mass practice has its schedule in which it involves longer practice or work time and a shorter rest period. On the other hand, distributed schedule is very different from mass schedule because distributed schedule will distribute the same amount of practice time across more sessions, and the distributed practice sessions must be extended over a longer period to achieve the same total amount of practice. And distributed schedule also has longer rest periods than massed schedule. These two terms mainly focus on the relative amount of time for active practice for a trial and the rest between trials. Lastly, massed schedule has either short or no rest interval between trials, and distributed schedule will have longer rest intervals.
Hello and good day everyone. Now let us proceed to the length and distribution of practice sessions. So for most instruction and rehabilitation situations, the primary practice distribution concerns is how to schedule within and between practice sessions for a specified amount of practice time. So as we described katong mga unang video, no, many instruction and rehabilitation situations have specified limits for the amount of available practice time. So for example, in most clinical applications, a patient may receive treatment for only a limited number of sessions because of healthcare management restrictions. So, best example ani niya is when a patient is receiving a chemotherapy. So, di ba, once under chemotherapy ang isa ka patient is daghan jud kay nagtambal nga magsulod sa iyang lawas, di ba? Combination of drugs ang pasulod sa iyang lawas ana. So given nga ana ang situation, so ang isa ka session is maglast jud siya og longer gid siya nga time. So for example is more than an hour, 2 hours to 3 hours inana jud ang isa ka session. So tungod ana is dili gid siya gina-restrict gid siya and nga everyday na siya buhaton nga session. Kay di ba lain pud ay kuan pud kaayo siya kanang dili jud siya ingon nga acceptable jud siya, no, kay ang lawas ba sa tao, di ba, dili ba gid ingon nga kaya gid niya to tanan nga unsa man galing to ang mga tambal. So with that, no, kasagara gyud sa mag-chemotherapy is 1 session per week lang, or ang uban is after 2 weeks aya pa na pod sila mag-receive og another nga session sa chemotherapy, and ang uban gani jud is 1 session per month lang gid na siya, no, depende po lagi sa situation sa patient. So also in teaching and coaching situations, there is often little flexibility in the number of days available for classes or practice sessions. So for example, if ang usa ka teacher is gihatagan lang siya og 10 days para mahuman niya ang discussion sa isa ka unit, so dapat ang iya pong practice schedule must fit ato nga limit, which is 10 days. Kailangan ma-discuss na niya or ma-deliver na niya sa student ang katong isa ka unit for within 10 days. And then another example is when a performer has a concert and then 1 month na lang then mag-concert na siya. So kailangan ang iyang rehearsal schedule ana, di ba, is iha pong i-fit pud niya sa iyang nabilin na lang, remaining time na lang niya, which is 1 month. So dapat within 1 month iset niya ang iyang goal nga ma-master na niya ang iyang performance within that 1 month para sa iyang concert. So given this example na, no, outside limitations may determine how many days a person should devote to practice, and however the instructor, coach, or therapist still decides the number of practice sessions and the length of each one. No, sila man jud, no, ang naagyoy dili ta mo ingon nga na I right kay kita man tanan na I right, pero mas naa sila better learning about anang pagset og pila ka session kailangan nimo i-take or imong i-receive og unsa pud ka kataason or unsa ka dugayon na siya nimo i-repeat nga mga sessions. So next is the benefit of more and shorter sessions. So research on the question of the length and distribution of practice sessions shows support for the benefit of distributed practice. So this means na kung ang experiment kay i-compare bitaw siya into a few long practice sessions with more frequent and shorter sessions, the results show that practicing skills during shorter sessions leads to better learning. And a classic example of research supporting this general conclusion is a study published many years ago by Baddeley and Longman, 1978. So they were attempting to determine the best way to schedule training sessions for postal workers on a mail sorting machine, which required operating a typewriter-like keyboard. So, in the study of Baddeley and Longman, the Postal Service had allotted a total of 60 hours and 5 days each week for training the workers. And available training time could be distributed in a variety of ways in terms of number of training sessions. The researchers, sila duha, they distributed this amount of time in 4 different ways, which are 1 hour or 1 session, to 1 session or one session a day, and it should vary in 12 weeks training. And then second is 1 hour or 1 session to 2 sessions or 2 days, and it will vary 6 weeks training. Then third is 2 hours or 2 sessions to 1 session or 1 day, which vary into 6 weeks training. And then last is 2 hours or 2 sessions for 2 sessions or 2 days, and it will vary 3 weeks training. So kaning upat ka different way nga pagbahin sa time sa katong duha ka researcher, si Baddeley og si Longman, is kaning upat ka buok mo nilahang gibahin sa katong pagkandak nila sa ilahang research. And 2 groups trained for 1 hour in each session. So one of these 2 groups practiced for only 1 session each day, which resulted in a total training time of 12 weeks. Whereas the second group had 2 sessions each day, and thereby reducing the number of weeks in training to 6 days. So 2 other groups practice for 2 hours in each session, and one of these groups had only 1 session each day, whereas the other had 2 sessions per day. So these later groups therefore had 6 weeks and 3 weeks of training. So mga ang ilahang difference. So here, we can see that these 4 schedules illustrate the variety of ways the researchers distributed 60 hours of practice. And the most distributed schedule required workers to train for 12 weeks, whereas the most massed schedule allowed them to complete their training in only 3 weeks. So the primary difference between these schedules was in how long each session was and how many sessions occurred each day. So as you can see here in the illustration, it describes the number of hours the trainees required to achieve a typing speed of 80 keystrokes per minute, which the motor perform one's goal for their training. And notice that only one of the 4 schedules, the most distributed schedule, resulted in the workers achieving this goal in the allotted training time of 60 hours. So they did it in 55 hours. So no, sa ato ang makita din ni sa illustration, no, makita man ninyo diha. So mo ni ang result nga na kuha ni Baddeley og ni Longman. So the other 3 groups required additional practice time. So it is interesting that those in the most massed schedule group, which practice 2 hour 2-hour sessions each day never achieved this goal, which is katong 30k stroke bitaw per minute. And after 80 hours of practice, they were still doing only a little better than 70k strokes per minute. And finally, with this research, the researchers obtained a very revealing result from the trainees' own ratings of the training schedules. So, although most workers prefer their own schedule, those in the most massed group prefer theirs the most, whereas members of the most distributed like theirs the least. And interestingly, these preferences were exactly opposite to the performance test result. So, more recent studies have shown similar learning benefits for distributed practice for a variety of motor skills. And as the following rate. So, Annette and Pitch 1985 found that 2-5 trial training sessions separated by 1 day led to better learning of a computer target shooting game than 1 10 trial session. And one trial involved shooting at 10 singly presented moving targets. And on the retention test, given 1 day after the end of the training session, the distributed group not only had more hits but also had less error in the shooting attempts. And second is Bowsed and Croshaw 1987 reported similar results lang gihapon for the learning of word processing skills. So typists who practiced 12 skills during 2 sessions of 35 and 25 minutes each, separated by a 10-minute break, required less time to learn the skills and had fewer errors on a test than typists who practiced the skills during 160 minutes per session. And the third is Shaya et al. 2000 showed that distributing practice sessions across days resulted in better learning than massing all the sessions within 1 day lang for 6 continuous dynamic balance tasks and a discrete key press timing task. Finally, in a study involving learning to put in golf, Dale and Christina 2004 had novice golfers practice putting a 3.7 meter distance for 240 trials. So one group followed a mass practice schedule in which they perform all the trials on 1 day with short breaks between blocks of 10 trials. So in contrast, another group practiced according to a distributed schedule of 60 trials per day for 4 consecutive days na siya. So the study involving learning to put in golf is showed in this figure. So, sa makita ninyo diha, no, at the end of practice, 240 practice trials, the distributed practice group performed a higher level than the massed schedule group. So, more importantly, this difference continued 1 and 7 days later on retention test of 60 trials. So it is also interesting to note that at the end of each block of 10 trials during practice sessions, the experiments asked the participants to predict their performance on the retention test. So for this assessment of their own competence, for example, ang ilahang metacognition, the participant who experienced the distributed schedule for more accurately predicted their retention test performance. So sa mga researches nga ato ang natakod ganina, to be specific, mga results studies of different researchers, makita gid nato ang differences sa ilahang different ways sa pag-conduct sa studies. So kasagara sa result ganina, di ba mabantayan ninyo, mostly the shorter session, ginaingon dito, are more effective or better, or kasagara result is distributed sessions is more effective or mas kuan siya, mas gakahatag siya or mas ga-result siya into better performance or kanang better way of achieving a goal gid siya compare sa katong math or katong mubo lang ang iyahang length pero ang iyahang session is mas longer, so mas effective yun ang katong shorter ang isa ka session but then distributed siya into mas longer nga or pila ka days ang distribution sa iyahang mga sessions. So taken together, no, the results of these experiments katong mga researchers ganina support the learning advantage of distributed over massed practice schedules when the number and length of practice sessions is the concern. So and when consider nato siya in terms of the types of motor skills involved in the experiment, no, the benefit of distributed practice kanang ga-extend jud siya to a variety of types of skills which includes discrete and continuous skills as well as open and closed skills. So in conclusion, no, although the researchers or the researches does not give us the specific number or length of practice sessions, no, that would be optimal for the learning of all motor skills. No, the conclusion that shorter and more practice sessions lead to a better learning than longer and fewer sessions provides an excellent general principle of which to base specific decisions when planning practice, training, or rehabilitation.
Explanation for the distributed practice benefit. There are at least three possible reasons why the distribution of practice session across more days leads to better learning than massing session within fewer days. So one is that fatigue. So fatigue is negatively influenced learning for mass practice schedule. Although none of the experiments discussed in this section assess part of fatigue, and it is possible to suspect that fatigue influenced learning because of the task performance requirements. For example, in the Shea 2000 experiment, participants perform a continuous dynamic balance task for 90 seconds on each trial. The mass practice schedule required them to perform 14 trials on the same day with only a 20-minute break between trial 7 and 8. And on the other hand, participants in the distributed practice schedule performed the second set of 7 trials on the following day. So it is similarly in the Dale and Christina 2004 experiment, who experienced the mass practice schedule perform 240 puts in one session with short rest breaks only after each set of 10 trials. In contrast, those who practice according the distributed schedule perform only 60 trials in each session. Second is the massing of practice within a day or a few days may reduce the amount is cognitive effort is used on each trial as practice continues beyond a certain critical amount. We consider this explanation in this chapter when we discuss reason why more practice beyond a certain amount can lead to diminished learning. The massing of practice trials may a practice condition in which performance of the skill on each trial becomes so repetitious that it becomes monotonous or boring. So as a result, the learning begins to decrease the amount of cognitive effort involved in each trial, which in turn diminishes the level of learning. So the possibility that both fatigue and reduced cognitive effort for poor learning that resulted from the mass compared to the distributed practice session can be seen in the result of the Shea et al. 2000 and Dale and Christina 2004 experiment. So this suggests that The task participants continue to practice, the effects of fatigue and reduced cognitive effort eventually began to influence their performance in a negative way. And this influence affected not only their practice performance but also their retention, test performance, indicating an influence on their learning the skills. Third explanation relates to memory consolidation, which is a long-term memory storage process. The memory hypothesis proposes that to store in memory the relevant information, we need to learn a skill. Certain neurobiochemical processes must occur. These processes, which transform a relatively unstable memory representation into a relatively permanent one, require a certain amount of time without additional practice of the same skills. So the distribution of practice across several days provides a better opportunity for the memory process to take place than does the massing of practice within a day or a few days. Relating practice distribution and contextual interference to skill learning context. The concept of contextual interference can be incorporated into practice distribution by organizing practice session to include principles related to both. The following are some examples that relate to three different skill learning contexts. First is physical education class. If several drills or other kinds of activity are planned for the day's lesson, use a station organization approach by assigning each skill for activity to a location in the gym or on the field so that there are several stations. Divide the class into groups and assign each to a station. Let the group stay in their station for about 12 to 15 minutes and then rotate to the next station. Continue this rotation approach for the entire period, and if the class period is sufficiently long, allow for 2 or more rotation. Next is sports-related practice. Practices for team and individual sports typically include several activities, rather than spend an extended amount of time on any one activity. Divide in half the amount of time planned for each activity and do each activity as 2 sets during practice. The 2 sets can be randomly or serially scheduled during the practice session. And the last one is physical rehabilitation session. Like sports-related practice session, rehab session typically involve several activities. And if the planned activities allow and apply the approach described for sports-related practice by dividing in half the total amount of time planned for each activity, and do each activity as 2 randomly or serially scheduled sets during the session.
Good day, everyone. My name is Aubrey Gabot, and I am going to discuss the intertrial interval and practices distribution. By far, the greatest amount of research on the distribution of practice has investigated the length of the intertrial interval, which relate to the amount of rest a person has between practice trials. One of the problems confronted when they trying to understand this research relates to the definition problem described earlier in this chapter. To elaborate on the general definitions presented earlier, we shall define massed practice and distributed practice. Massed practice as practice in which the amount of rest between trials is either very short or non-existent, so that practice is relatively continuous. Distributed practice is practice in which the amount of rest between trials or of groups is relatively long. Although the terms very short and relatively long in these definitions are somewhat ambiguous, they allow us to generalize as much as possible from the research literature on massed versus distributed practice to motor skills learning situations. A history of controversy. The controversy is evident in reviews of this literature as well as motor learning textbooks. Both provide a variety of answers to the practice distribution question. 2 problems underlie the controversy surrounding these issues. Number 1, the first relates to the issue of practice performance versus learning effects. Many of the experiments on mass versus distributed practice did not include retention or transfer trials. The second problem is that researchers generally have failed to consider that the two practice distribution schedules may have different learning effects on different types of skills. According to Donovan and Radosevic in 1999, Lee and Genevos in 1988, two reviews of the distributed practice research literature have helped resolve these problems and the controversy about which practice schedule is better for learning motor skills. Both reviews involve a statistical analysis, known as meta-analysis, to evaluate the research literature. Two major reviews support the conclusion that distributed practice promotes better acquisition than massed practice, because distributed practice being more restful leads to less fatigue and would therefore be expected to result in better acquisition performance. Their conclusion was that the type of task was an important variable in determining practice distribution effects for schedules related to the length of intertrial rest intervals. More specifically, Lee and Genovese in 1988 and 1989 provided evidence that the type of practice distribution schedule that results in better learning depends on whether the skill is continuous or discrete. We will look at each of this type of skill next. The continuous skills have been the most common type of motor skills used to investigate the effects of massed versus distributed practice between trials. And the most popular task has been the rotary pursuit task, in which a person must keep a handheld stylus in contact with a small disc or rotating turntable for as long as possible. A trial is usually a specified length of time, such as 20 or 30 seconds. This task is quite easy to specify the massed and distributed inter-trial interval lengths. Mass practice schedule typically have few, if any, seconds or rest between trials, whereas the intervals in distributed schedules are as long as or longer than the trials themselves. Because of this, researchers can establish intertrial interval lengths that are readily identifiable as distinctly masked or distributed. The Lee and Genovese in 1988 review found that the consistent result has been that distributed schedules lead to better learning than masked schedules for learning continuous motor skills. Discrete skills. When researchers use discrete skills to investigate the issue of intertrial massed versus distributed practice, a problem arises that is directly related to the definition problem we discussed earlier. If a massed schedule allows no rest between trials, whereas a distributed schedule involves a rest interval that is same length as the practice trial, then the two constructed intertrial intervals will be essentially the same length because a discrete responsive is typically very short. For example, if people are practicing a rapid aiming task that has a duration of approximately 150 milliseconds, the distributed practice condition could, by definition, have a 150 millisecond intertrial interval. But if the mass condition had no rest between trials, only 150 milliseconds would separate the two practice schedules. Thus, the operational definition of the terms massed and distributed becomes especially important in experiments using discrete tasks. Lee and Genovese in 1988 found only one study in the research literature that used a discrete task. The result of the study, and one subsequently reported by Lee and Genovese, provide evidence that mass practices schedules results in better learning for discrete motor skills. A final comment about practice distribution and motor learning. In this discussion of practice distribution effects on the learning of motor skills, an important distinction was made between two specific issues related to practice distribution: the length and frequency of practice sessions, and the length of the inter-trial interval for a series of practice trials. These two issues are often overlooked as distinct even though research evidence supports the distinction. A significant reason for the distinction is that two different conclusions concerning how to best distribute practice associated with each issue. When the length and frequency of practice sessions is the practice distribution concern, distributed practice results in better learning than massed practice, regardless of the type of skill being learned. On the other hand, when the length of the inter-trial interval for a series of practice trials is the concern, the type of skill being learned is an important consideration.